Sure. Okay, great, present. And I'd just like to share too, like if you have any questions or comments, feel free to enter in the chat or follow up with me via email, just because I am running on a little bit a short timeline. So a little bit about myself and the work I do today is I created Queer Brown Vegan. So I am a former environmental scientist turned into an environmental educator. I did my undergrad in at Berkeley to study sustainability, the environment, and really look into how we really interact with the world. And I saw a really huge disconnect when it came to media issues and communications when it came to climate. And so I started my platform back in 2019. And I truly believe that education is a very accessible way to kind of open the gateway for a lot of people to become curious. And I guess I relate this back into my own journey being vegan of almost 9 years now, is that like it was through an environmental class that really got me to understand more around the literature around animal rights, human rights, and environmental rights, and how they're really interconnected to each other. So a little bit about the discussion we're going to be having today is around the concept of queer ecology. And this is a more academic type term that's really focused on really understanding it through an institutional lens. I'm not sure who's clicking it on the background, but if you can mute yourself, thank you. So queer ecology was actually first coined by an environmental studies professor, Katerina Sandilands, in the 1990s. And what she argued in the book itself, which is a really great read that you should read, is around this assumptions of how heteronormativity shows up in scientific institutions. And when you read this, people can kind of get confused, or they're more like, I don't really understand. So what she really argued is around this idea of how scientific models, especially in STEM related careers, were really not listening to the queer diverse perspectives that existed, but this idea of really what really makes a species healthy. And what she saw and what she had analyzed and researched is that a lot of these biological frameworks that we had followed in these institutions had only seen a species as quote unquote natural if they were able to reproduce, or they were able to have offspring, or they were able to, fall in love between male and female. And the problem around this idea of categorization is that it kind of adheres to this Western model, and I would call it colonial model, because in a lot of indigenous science that we talk about today, whether that's traditional ecological knowledge or whether that's looking at, cultural based experiences, this idea around, how science is detailed as this superior model is actually redistributed. So in the ways of how we look at queer ecology, what the professor was saying is that these ideas of heterosexual reproduction that leads into this idea of what is seen as natural in the animal world or seen as natural in our human world really disrupts this narrative. It means like it upholds uniformity, and it kind of really deconstructs this idea of what we usually had as indigenous individuals or people who come from indigenous cultures. And I would like to say that when we talk about queer ecology, I want to kind of look at the fact that from an environmental scientist perspective, we kind of see these species from the flora, the fauna, the fungi as either species that are either male or female, and that their duty or their role to contribute to the environment means that their offspring is being, kept alive in the next generation, or whether that's this idea of how fungi are heavily misunderstood in our academic science fields. And so one thing that I look at it as a vegan myself is like, how might the non-human world, which is the flora, the fauna, the fungi, teach us human society principles around resilience and liberation? And that is something that is not going to be answered in this obviously lecture, because it's an ongoing response. But one thing is this idea that species are always against uniformity and promoting cultural diversity. And one thing I'd like to say too is that each species that we talk about here today has their own diverse language, their diverse language and motives of love, and their diverse ways of seeing the world that we as humans may not always understand, that we attempt ourselves to always be in coexistence with. And so I think when people ask me, like, why do you talk about queer ecology? Like, why should I even care? I actually share this a very personal experience, is that when I was an young environmental scientist in college, I remember just feeling this sense of like disconnect. I was feeling like I didn't really have anyone to relate to around my own journey. And I often felt that it was really the non-human world that allowed me to kind of express myself and to understand like the types of pain, the misery, the types of like experiences that I had as a young person. And so I think that this brutal isolation that I faced as a young person, whether that was working on the weekends with my dad as a gardener, pulling weeds, spraying pesticides, like killing pests, like I started to realize like there's this type of connection between this destruction of biodiversity and this understanding of our own identities as people who identify as LGBTQ. So that's when I started to really understand a little bit more about what queerness and the environment are interconnected from that very individualized lens. But the second thing is really looking at it from this Western science academic model. So the year is around 2016, and I'm actually taking a wildlife ecology course on, species and how they reproduce and what's needed for species to exist. And I had a professor that said that, animals are queer. And I was just like, what? Like, what does that even mean? And it kind of really made me realize that historically, academic science has done a very, not impressive, but a unfortunate job of erasing same-sex behaviors or relationships exhibited by species. But the second thing that's also very unique about the animal kingdom specifically is the fact that a lot of what they do as species is disrupt a lot of these models of what heteronormativity looks like. One example up here is right the Laysan albatross bird, which challenges this idea of like parenthood, right, or care for a young one. And I thought that was a very interesting example when I was like in college because I was like, oh, why don't you hear about this in science? And I found out earlier from historical records that Harvard and other institutions actually would silence a lot of researchers and scientists who attempted to talk about these types of behaviors, or they were seen as quote unquote anomalies to the science. So again, yet again, as we see this research being amplified and kind of forwarded towards society, we are seeing this disruption of what actually quote unquote natural or unnatural species is looking like. And another thing is that I like to really look at it from the biological science side is that a lot of times people like to say like clownfish or trans, but I would like to say too, like, again, like clownfish, right, are able to transition from their quote unquote biological sex organs through this process called sequential hermaphroditism, which is a reproductive strategy that is seen in other fish species. And one thing that I like to examine from a socio-political lens is how these like transitions are occurring. And a lot of them in the animal kingdom and its own culture and its own environment. These species are transitioning or changing or challenging this type of behaviors that they do without violence, without hierarchy, without exclusion. And I think it's really important that we kind of separate this idea around gender and sex because gender is very heavily formed on socio-political norms and cultures of our society, which is not to say that the non-human world does not adhere to their own culture, but rather this idea of transphobia and homophobia that stems under the umbrella of white supremacy is really talking about the human world, right? So again, these are kind of examples of where we kind of see this disruption of this Western science model that tries to uphold this idea that reproduction, opposite sex pairings is the only way that an animal is seen as natural. But in fact, this has always been seen as evident through history that these species are natural. Um, and again, this is just like a reminder for a lot of people out there is that humans and animals are not the same. And I try to be very careful of not equating it, but rather using the examples I'm providing as through a metaphorical lens, which is why a lot of LGBTQ plus folks often see these experiences as parallels or metaphorical examples. Um, and again, one thing that we learned from nature, and even how nature disrupts this idea of what it means to transition, is that for transgender people here in our world, in the human world, transitioning whether socially, medically, or not at all is not defined by your biological sex, but by the capacity to live authentically, to live with identity in alignment with your identity. So I think it's really important when we're connecting this human experience and the non-human experiences together, is how do we tell more inclusive stories around these species? And oftentimes, I think that as a scientist and as someone who was a young queer person in my early days, recognizing who I was, I remember just thinking that, I was told that in this world that, heteronormativity was the only way to live in a healthy, safe world. But in fact, that is not true. And we have seen through history that queer and trans or two-spirit individuals in indigenous communities have always existed. And this idea around gender has always been in a very expansive form of the ways that we see it. And again, this is just more like a scientific side of the institution, is that gender and sex are very different. And when I refer to sex, I'm referring it to this Western biological science form that is often characterized not just by, body parts, but rather through anatomy, through physiology, through gene expressions, through chromosomes, through the non-human animal cells, through behavior, through intersex. And one thing that I've noticed that from a scientific perspective that I've noticed that in the 80s and 90s, a lot of research would often use animal-based studies and conflate gender and sex as the same thing. And so I think it's important that we recognize that gender is something that's very exclusive towards the human world in terms of how we interact with it, rather than this idea of trying to impose it or equate it the same. Because again, my intentions are not to equate it, to erase the struggles that Black or Indigenous trans folks that go through, or marginalized folks with LGBTQ identities also face with. So again, there's a lot of layers to that. I'm going to go to the next slide. And so I think it's really important that we remember that queer ecology is not so much this idea of putting a rainbow to things and saying like gay penguins, gay giraffes, like trans clownfish. It's rather to like extend our idea of liberation and to push ourselves to examine like how do we see natural versus unnatural in society, and is there even such a thing as being natural in the world when all of us here have unnatural identities, experiences, not just from the ways of who we are as people, but the ways that we interact, the ways that we speak to the non-human world or human world. And one thing that I think a lot of people don't recognize is that a lot of LGBTQ people are outdoor lovers. We love animals. We love to be outside. And I think one thing, the reason why people love the outdoors is that it provides this sense of communion, this sense of knowing or understanding. And so it's really important to know that we as environmentalists, or even if you don't refer yourself as an environmentalist, acknowledging these types of differences in the world of how we see each other. And I think I connect this back into my own, not my own journey, but other journeys of experiences of young queer folks in America or in other countries, is that a lot of LGBTQ individuals are often living in hidden states of worlds. And, you know, in order for us to live in continuity, we have to ask ourselves what types of spaces are being designed for us through not just a human-centric lens, but like, a multi-species lens. What does that mean to include all of us in that type of phrase and statement? And when it comes to climate change and climate crisis, I think it's important that we talk about how this is all interconnected into it. As we know that in our current democracy today, FEMA has been cut, which is disaster relief. And it's important to know that when climate disasters strike, around 20 to 45% of people who are homeless identify as LGBTQ. And a lot of these people, when we talk about frontline communities, people are often like, well, what does a frontline person mean? It's usually people who are disabled, people who are immunocompromised, people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color. And I also include like the non-human world, right? That is sometimes not always included in these types of conversations. So I think it's important that we understand that the more that we see these climate disasters, the more attempts that we'll see about severing these types of relationships with folks. And I would just like to say that other data and stats have found that like same-sex couples tend to live in areas with high level of pollution, which gives us another further reasoning of like this idea of like queering environments doesn't just mean putting a rainbow on it, it means putting justice on these things, meaning that we have access to clean air, water, that people have affordable housing, that people have affordable healthcare. these are all things that obviously that we are not having in our society right now, or that we are currently losing. And so how do we kind of hang on to these stories? Um, and I think one thing that I kind of want to leave off with is like, how do we build from queer ecology this idea of challenging these assumptions that we make about the natural versus the unnatural type of worlds, and looking into queering sustainability, looking at the ways of the active practices and methods of actually crafting a world that is better for all LGBTQ communities. And that's through different lenses of beauty justice, health, housing justice, environmental justice. And something I always tell people is that, like, rather than viewing queerness in nature as like this anomaly, which I think it's beautiful that we also see ourselves as this unique standpoint, we also must recognize that we are a part of this inherent species rich world that we live in today. And some additional resources that I would like to leave off with is this really great book called Forest Euphoria by my good talented friend Patricia Ononiwu Cation, that talked about the queerness of nature. She is a queer mycologist that has studied fungi. I actually shot an episode with her about queer fungi, queer ecology on YouTube, and then organization of queer nature on that end. And one thing I would like to say is like, when we think about queering spaces through a queer ecological lens, is thinking about like who designed your local parks and community centers? Where do LGBTQ people live in your town? And how does that expose them to greater levels of pollution? And how do LGBTQ people in your community view their relationship with the planet? Um, I know that I am actually running out of time, but I just want to say thank you so much again for everyone for having me. I do have to run. I don't have any time for questions. I'm already running late, but thank you so much again, everyone. And I hope you have an amazing day. And please reach out if you have further questions. And I would recommend watching it on YouTube if you want to learn more about queer ecology. I think there's a more thorough, in-depth lecture on that end. So thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Oh, okay. I like to tell people that I count sheep for a living, and that sleep has very little to do with it. It does keep me up sometimes. The sanctuary is about 115 acres total on the side of the mountain, but the residents are, for the most part, free roaming throughout 50 of those acres. Part of my job is to act as an accountant to make sure the sheep and the other residents are present and healthy. Um, but when I count, usually the sheep are the least of my concerns because for the first half hour after sunrise, they're usually investigating the front pasture by the entrance for fresh grass. Um, but so in the morning, the cows are my main worry. Uh, the eldest and most vulnerable stay near the barns in the front pasture, so they're easy to find. So right now that's Bella, Bee, and Athena. But the rest prefer the back pastures, and in particular the furthest away pasture where the terrain is most difficult. They seem to like the area where it's uneven, rocky, deeply forested, and muddy for most of the seasons. And they recently decided that the highest point of the mountain is the best spot to graze, which good for them. I'm glad they get to go where they want to go, but it means I have to take a 15-minute hike up the side of a mountain just to distinguish between a boulder, a resting cow, and hopefully not a cow that's fallen over. It's tedious because there's a lot of urgent chores to do in the morning, but I always find myself reporting back to the rest of the staff every day about the little quirks during these counts, like finding the herd in some new section of the forest, or when someone decides to sleep in and wakes up in shock when the rest of the herd is missing from the barn. I find it grounding because I get to meet every member of the herd each day and see what makes each individual and each day different. Um, and when I used to close the sanctuary in the evenings, my main concern were the birds. So the chickens, the ducks, geese, turkeys, guineas. I'm not too concerned about the emus. The emus are pretty good. Most of them head into the coops at sunset, which are then shut for the night, but of course that's not guaranteed. Different corners of the sanctuary, there's about 31 doors to accommodate different mobility issues and the robust social lives of the chickens, especially. And only after about 3 rounds of counting do I allow myself to go home. And even then, I sometimes got up in the middle of the night and drove back because I had to make sure that they're all closed. I've never left them open, but like I said, sleep has very little to do with it. And this counting imbues a sense of responsibility that keeps me up at night. And so this week I've been thinking about counting animals, like counting as a tool, counting as a practice. And if you're in an environmental animal justice space, there's always some large number and is usually put at the forefront of any given conversation. Did anyone see back in September last year, New Zealand's Department of Conservation did an advertising campaign called Population 695 billion-ish. The joke was that after a recent census, the national population of New Zealand jumped to 695 billion because they decided to recount to include what counts. So there's like 5.3 million humans, which account for 0.001% of that figure, and the rest of that is the non-human mammals, birds, reptiles, freshwater fish, plants, mollusks, and annelids, which are the worms, basically. And there's a bunch of their videos on their social media that are pretty fun. The uh, the main one shows a woman with a clipboard going around with a magnifying glass, taking a tally of each individual ant on the ground and saying each number out loud. And the rest of the videos take one of these absurdly large numbers to introduce a member representing their species. Like, for example, meet neighbor 2,385,593,120, who's a very secretive Kiwi. It's fun because it uses count in two ways. Count in the enumerative sense and count as in to say that their situations matter. They're counted because they count. I mean, it's a playful campaign, but I think it makes visible something about counting, and then I want to look at more closely. I mean, obviously, there aren't census takers going around New Zealand meeting every single individual critter to mark a tally on their clipboards, like I kind of do at the sanctuary. That number was generated by compiling data from several databases, and those databases were compiled by a bunch of researchers, and the actual work of those instances of researchers were done by extrapolation. So, like, where individuals in a set area were converted to units of population density and then multiplied by some total area of compatible habitat. So there are layers and layers and layers of this sort of extrapolation and conversion, which means that this count involved interaction with very few individuals, at least relative to that 695 billion. And so what the New Zealand Department of Conservation makes clear is that these large numbers at some level give the performance of working with each individual when that's almost never the case. I like the campaign, but I don't think I need to explain what can go wrong when people are collected en masse and standardized. Expressions like more than just a number and not wanting to be another statistics are common enough in our vocabulary that we all know the politics of large numbers reinforce stigmas and overlook the differences, the queerness of particular individuals. There's a dangerous habit in public discourse, I think, that allows data to replace the work of conversations, where people think that dropping numbers and charts and graphs is enough to prove their point. And activists are definitely not innocent of this either, um, turning potential conversations into situations where you bludgeon other people with numbers. Um, I've even seen people both online and in person make up numbers on the spot to give an illusion of objectivity. But all that said, large numbers play a vital role in our rhetoric and our understanding. Obviously, we shouldn't do away with numbers in our activism. I studied mathematics in university because we need them to track harm over time, perceive patterns, and make certain claims that can travel beyond our immediate experience. And without numbers, it becomes much harder to say things like, this is not an isolated case, this is a structure, and that there's a system of injustice that goes beyond a single loss. And the point I'm trying to make is that counting is an act of focusing attention. It directs us towards certain beings, patterns, scales, and away from others. And the misconception is that a count is just a record of what is there, but really counting is about deciding what is worth noticing, what can be grouped together, and what can be set aside, for the moment. And I'm going to be repeating for the moment a lot. And even though numbers are kind of seen as a symbol of objectivity, we should recognize that numbers are always partial, distributed, and relational. And I want to encourage people to use counting responsibly. So I had a few observations that I wanted to mention, and I want to hear other people's thoughts about them. And I think they're obvious points, but I think it's worthwhile to look at the obvious again every once in a while. So the first point is that counts produce an identity that requires desingularization for a cause. I've lived and visited in a lot of cities in the last several years, so I've encountered a lot of street demonstrations organized by different groups. And a common sight at those demonstrations is someone carrying around a laptop linked to the website Animal Kill Clock, which you might have seen before. The main page displays a number representing the number of animals killed for food since January 1st in the United States, or UK, Australia, Canada. There's different pages for different countries. But it updates every second, and the number it increases by is determined by dividing the estimate for the total annual deaths of some previous year. So for the US counter, using reports from 2020, it takes up 3,516 per second. And it's that second to second update that gets me. And of course, that's the point of the website. It gives the performance of counting when this tick by tick counting isn't actually happening, like with the New Zealand advertising campaign. It's very mechanical in the way that it marches, and I almost want to watch to see if there's a moment where this imaginary census taker makes a hiccup and strays away from that 3,516 for a second, even though I know it won't. And there's no room for knowing the circumstances of each death or for knowing who was killed or their species, which could be a cow or a chicken or a shrimp, or for recognizing any variety in their temporal experience. So for the moment that this number is at the center of attention, the only detail that matters is that they died and it was potentially preventable. And that's the power of a count, and it's important for our understanding to have a sense of scale through numerosity. Behind all the work that goes into collecting and modifying numbers to form a count is some unifying cause. It takes someone's judgment and effort to construct because tallies like this don't just exist out in the world. And the purpose of these tallies is to mobilize, to have someone's or something's come together to denounce and stop an injustice. And counts are one of the many ways of bringing together, and it does so by naturalizing an equivalence between individuals. It has power through its formation of an identity that for the moment says that this one particular characteristic is relevant and worth consideration, and for the moment says to look past differences between singular entities. And again, this isn't bad, but can be problematic if it's the only way we talk about differences in the world. And so the animal kill clock forms an identity that unites cows, chickens, pigs, fish, and others through their deaths. It asks you for the moment to suspend where specific individuals lived, who they affected, or how they died. It just says that they can be counted together as victims of a shared commodity system that could be changed. And I keep repeating for the moment because a count or a tally is a momentary act. It's not fixed and it can be very effectively be used to supplement other ways of relating. It helps make multiplication possible by offering this collective sense of scale. But what I take issue with is when people treat a count as a fixed march along using a rhythm of mechanical ticking as their only way of getting or moving within public discourse, and forget that counting in the enumerative sense is a means to invite others to count, like in the sense of considering them to matter. And so far, I've only talked about counts for units or individuals. There's a lot of other numbers on the Animal Kill Clock website. It's subtitled by the numbers. So, and there are a lot of people who aren't as moved by the fact of non-human individuality. So a pragmatic approach would be to address the issues in ways that may be more salient to a wider audience. So for example, animal use is often talked about in terms of space, like saying that 41% of US land is used for livestock and animal feed production, or that the typical space for a battery cage hen amounts to an 8 by 10-inch space. And sometimes water use is that identity. And so bodies are transformed into something else with these new units, like gallons, acres, emissions, pounds. And again, this can be and is effective because it translates to other registers of concern. And the risk is that the more weaponized these conversions become, the more they can displace the people they're meant to speak for. The animals become something other than an animal, something that fits more easily into an economic ways of calculating values. And this risk endorsing the thought processes that we're trying to condemn. And so we're faced with kind of a dilemma. Counts are vital to making a case, to give a sense of scale to mobilize action. But if it's used as a solid, indisputable object beyond engagement, then there's the risk of reinforcing a way of identifying the entities in the count that made that harm possible in the first place. And so the next point I wanted to make was that counts are selective. They're not just reductive, they're also selective. And so counting is inherently exclusionary. We count to form some mobilizing identity, and by necessity, it, for the moment, draws a boundary that excludes someone's or something's, and this boundary work shapes the world of how we respond. And I don't say this as a criticism, it's just a condition of counting. You have to decide what doesn't belong in the set when you decide what does belong in the set for the moment. So here's a count that's posted on the Vine website, which I think might need updating. It's from 2024.
Yeah.
But we have a community made up of those we call residents, so sanctuary residents, and we've counted them. And so the sanctuary is home to many, many more critters that are listed here, but this is just the subset of those animals that we spend our efforts in maintaining their food, shelter, healthcare. And it's these individuals that are tallied at sunrise and sunset, the cows, the goats, the sheep, the birds, the pigeons, chickens. And this block also points out that we're particularly receptive to the wild turkeys, pigeons, and ducks that also come over and use these food and shelters. And of course, this block means that there are also lots of other animals that use the sanctuary forest and mountainside as their permanent or temporary home that are not included in this resident count. Like, for example, the coyotes, weasels, bears, birds of prey. Like I saw the barred owl this morning. Oh, and this photo in the corners of Felix, who lives next to the office. And we don't directly feed and give frequent health care to those lovely animals that call the sanctuary home. And we often take efforts to deter them from being among the residents in certain areas and prevent the residents from being eaten. Um, but we still live in community with them and we don't take steps to harm them. But our relationship and responsibilities to them for the moment is different than those that we refer to in our resident counts. And I think the human staff should be included in the resident count since half of them live on site anyway. Um,
They are admitted under other.
oh, is there?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
I do the count.
Um, but I think that all acts of care or justice need some semblance of a determinate protection, which means that lines need to be drawn somewhere for the moment. Because if you try to include everything that matters equally all at once in every single situation, you end up not doing anything. So the momentary exclusion that's inherent to counting is what makes counting meaningful. We say that someone or something counts and that they matter, which implicitly for the moment says that there are entities out there that are not the focus of our attention, for the moment. Um, and like the last point I made, problems happen when we forget that our counting is contingent and we always need to be vigilant to the fact that our lines could be drawn differently and that in other moments, will be drawn differently. And there's an example of that in the vine count. The wild turkeys and deer that aren't part of our day-to-day resident counts that we actively feed and build coops and barns for. Um, but when there's the risk of hunters, it becomes a moment where we're more receptive to them. And the same that can be said with the weasels and hawks, even though we don't count them as residents for our day-to-day purposes, and even though they may be a risk to the chickens mainly, we're still receptive to them. So what I'm trying to say is that the momentary exclusion that's inherent to counting is necessary, but we can't forget that this exclusion can have other consequences, and we shouldn't forget that. And so the last thing I wanted to point out is that what you gain from the act of counting can be more important than the actual result of that count. Um, so the end result of a count is a number where every individual is defined by unifying identity. But in the process of counting, if you're open to it, you notice differences because you're paying attention to what makes them similar, and you have a frame of reference of what makes the individual unique. So at Vine, the number of cows I find in the morning is important, but it's more important that this count lets me notice how healthy they are and how they group together, and how they respond to my presence. And just this morning, the count put Cora, a cow, at the center of my attention. I spent almost an hour walking around the sanctuary this morning trying to find her, but I eventually gave up and did other morning chores, and I went back to look for her 45 minutes later, and she magically appeared with the rest of the herd. She does that often. And Cora's the only cow that was born on site, so she's very comfortable with the landscape and is by far the most mobile of the herd. And she discovers and develops corners of the sanctuary that the staff isn't super keen on, but the cows make it their own. And that wild goose chase she puts me on in a lot of mornings provides me some insights about the movements of the cows, for the 23 hours a day that they're not under our active surveillance. And that's different from the kinds of counts that I've been talking about at larger scales, because when counting becomes automated or fixed into a number that just circulates abstractly, we lose that kind of encounter. And as people that care about environmental and animal issues, I know that the numbers formed in good faith favor our causes. So I want to insist that these numbers are used responsibly by engaging with them with an openness that resonates in a queer ecology sense that promotes more fluid, responsive ways of relating to others. And I'm lucky to be at Vine, but not everybody works at a farmed animal sanctuary, so I wanted to offer another example of counting that you can do. I recommend visiting a high traffic area. My favorite spots are Pike Street in Seattle and right in front of Blackwell's bookshop in Oxford. Find a high traffic area, find a group of pigeons, and then count their toes. It's for reference, most city pigeons have 4 pink toes on each foot, three in the front and one in the back. And that being said, you will, the attentive toe counters, I'm sure you are, will inevitably find some with fewer than those expected 8 digits. And it could be that an entire foot's missing. And I do this and then I invite other people to do it because it's an invitation for intentional world making, to recognize the bodily diversity of a species that too many people think are homogenous. Um, it asks, what about cities and pigeons enable these kinds of toe discrepancies? And to acknowledge our situatedness in how limited our explanations are, because sometimes they're born that way, sometimes their toes are tangled in string or human hair, sometimes the result of some infection. But in the moment of counting, you don't know the life history of this specific pigeon, and this not knowing is important to getting to know others better without a controlling sense of righteousness. And I started this toe counting exercise as a student, and I was encountering a lot of activist groups in large urban hubs. And there's a lot of diversity in these groups, and it's not a generalization, but like I said in the beginning, I grew concerned about the activists that weaponize a sense of a rhetoric of universal progress, like this idea that we're moving in a predestined direction and that everyday experiences are just some stepping stones in service of some inevitability. And that the counts that we use are that they become a mechanical marching order. And this idea makes people believe that they know all the answers and that their job is just to make everybody else know. And these universalist frameworks cause a lot of the same imaginative constraints as the systems we need to move away from, because they make us oblivious to the specific calls of those around us. And I've learned from the pigeons who are weaving between human legs and protest signs that attentiveness is better than certainty in a lot of cases. So we need to use these numbers, but the goal is not just the achievement of some other numbers, but to find ways of relating that exceed numbers. And so everything's entangled and inconsistent, and counts are one of many acts of discretion in our efforts to live in it. I think our flourishing lies in dialogue with all of our worldly companions. And so we have to ask, like, for the moment, who are seen as subjects of justice in our shared worlds? How are these entities recognized under frameworks? All frameworks, whether they're the hegemonic frameworks of exploitation or the new insurgent frameworks of activists. And how can we trouble these understandings by being attentive to the specific calls of the who's around us? And again, whatever answers we find are not some finalist state affairs, so we're perpetually bound to keep going to care for the critters and communities that we love. So in a nutshell, the lesson of queer ecology is no fixed categories. Our lives must be made, well, they are made in the presence of those who bear their consequences. Be that those urban birds, our sometimes troublesome human neighbors, or enumerated sanctuary sheep. That's the word I was looking for. So you just got to make them count by counting. So yeah, it's a bit rambling, but that's what I wanted to share. I don't know how to stop sharing my screen. Nope, there it is.
So, um, uh, for anyone who doesn't already know, this is an event sponsored by Vine Sanctuary. Vine is an LGBTQ-led farmed animal refuge, um, that at which hundreds of non-human animals are formal residents, and countless non-human animals are make this habitat their home, whether or not we even know that they're here. And we're just going to talk about a very small subset of them. And I started off with a picture of ducks, and we're going to talk about ducks first because ducks are especially known for their queer ways, and because ducks were the people who first alerted us, meaning the two human co-founders of the sanctuary, to the opportunity, importance, necessity of thinking about the interconnections among queer and animal oppression and liberation. So, of course, ducks vary by species, but to give you some sense of their queerness, mallard ducks, uh, let me start that sentence ago. Approximately 100% of male mallard ducks are functionally bisexual. And for many, many, many other ducks, same-sex relations among the males are very common. But it wasn't wild ducks or commonly domesticated ducks like this lovely wood duck. Um, but oh no, where are the images? Can you see images?
No.
Okay. Ooh, wait, one moment here. What has happened? Ah, all right. I'm so sorry, everybody. Here we go. I'm very sorry. It just made all the images go away for a second. We can see them? There we go. So in 2002, a group of ducks who had been rescued from a foie gras factory came to live at what was then called the Eastern Shore Chicken Sanctuary and is now called Vine Sanctuary. We were delighted by them. We loved everything about them, everything. They were charming. They were so friendly. They were friendly, so sociable with each other. They were friendly with the rescued chickens. They even adopted a rescued chicken who came to the sanctuary with a broken wing and a broken uh, leg and a broken beak. We called him Chumbawamba because he got back up again after being knocked down. And the ducks adopted him. But then one day, I saw two ducks fighting, or so I thought. Long story short, two ducks kept engaging in what seemed to be like fighting. I kept separating them because we don't have fighting at a sanctuary. And the one who I kept taking to a different coop kept making his way back to the other. And then they would talk to each other. And then I would say, okay, you must have had an argument. And then I'd turn around and they'd be fighting again. The one who kept coming back had to go to extraordinary lengths to get back from the one coop to the other. It involved walking through woods and climbing a fence and walking down a road and making a sharp left turn into the driveway. It was a lot. Um, and it took 3 rounds of me separating them and him doggedly making his way back until I realized that it wasn't fighting, it was sex. Those two ducks we called Jean Paul and Jean Claude. Jean Paul is the one in the front of the picture here, and Jean Claude is the one walking away. This was before smartphones, and we didn't even have a cell or digital camera, so this was a snapshot that we scanned. And it's the only photo I have of the two ducks who turned out to have such an extraordinary impact on the sanctuary. As soon as I realized that they were boyfriends, of course I stopped breaking them up. They stayed together for their whole lives. They were not monogamous because ducks are not, but they slept together, cuddled up in the barn every night. They spent most of every day together. And many years after they arrived, when Jean Paul died of the liver disease associated with the foie gras production, Jean Claude, who had seemed to be perfectly healthy, died within a week. Those two ducks made me realize that we really needed to think. Because I knew this fact that I just talked to you about the most male ducks being functionally bisexual. I knew that. I had read a book. And yet when I saw them, I assumed it was fighting. So that got me thinking, whoa, what's going on in my head? But also the determination of that duck who kept being separated from his boyfriend by a giant ape, just saying, nah, I'm going back. I'm going back. That is some powerful eros. That's some powerful relationship and should not be ignored. Thinking about that made me think about how easy it is. Made me think about all of the ways that, as Isaias was reporting, um, the erasure of animals who engage in same-sex relationships was purposeful. But I also thought about the impact of that. The impact of that is that it makes homosexuality seem unnatural, which is something that so many people say to us queer folks. It's unnatural. Um, so that's a way that something that the stereotyping of animals hurts humans. But then I thought about how it hurts them too. Because if you recognize that two ducks can have such a strong bond that the one is going to risk walking down a road with cars going by to get back to his boyfriend, well, then that's going to be a lot harder to lock them up in a foie gras factory or vivisection lab, right? So shout out to Jean Paul and Jean Claude for the power of their love and for alerting us at the sanctuary to the importance of this topic, which even now, so many 20 some years later, we still need to talk urgently about. Next, we're going to talk about emus and geese. And I just included this photo because I really like it. Emus. All right, there was a time. There was a time when if you counted on the observations of scientists, you would have to believe that 100% of emus were exclusively homosexual. And this is because scientists, the only emu sex scientists had ever observed was male on male. I like that story just because it reminds us, one, because I like to laugh at the scientists, but two, because it reminds us of how imprecise, how limited, how limited doesn't even begin to describe our knowledge of other animals and their relations with each other and their relations with other animals. We talk all big, but we know so little, and that's why I really loved what Elijah said about how attentiveness is better than certainty, because there's so much we don't know. But what we do know about emus is that they are queer in both senses. Clearly, there are same-sex relations because scientists observed them a lot. But they're also queer in that wider sense. And when I talk about a wider sense of queerness, I'm talking about um, not only engaging in same-sex courtship, pair bonding, parenting, romance, sex, but also, as we said, um, defying categories, countering stereotypes, engaging in affections outside of the heteronormative assumption that all non-human animals are reproducing robots whose only aim in life is to get their genes into the next generation. Engaging in love and care outside of or in conjunction with the heteronormative pair bond. So emus are queer in both of those ways, and a lot of others, as anybody who's been here to the sanctuary can testify. Now, speaking about those other ways of being queer, I want to talk about gray-lag geese and a particular goose called Clyde. I will admit that the original photo does not have that pretty background. This is another photo from a real long time ago that I had to rescue so that you could see Clyde. And I wanted you to, there was a cluttered background. I wanted you to see Clyde in all his glory. Clyde was a gray-lag goose. Gray-lag geese are also among the animals who, uh-oh, did you lose the screen?
You
I
still
did.
see Clyde.
Okay, I don't see Clyde anymore. So I have to figure out how to see Clyde. I'm just going to stop the share and restart the share. There. Okay. You see Clyde?
Yes.
And I see Clyde. Okay. So Clyde is a gray-lag geese. Gray-lag goose, or was. Gray-lag geese are also known for, particularly gray-lag geese males, are known not only for engaging in same-sex uh, sexual relations, but pair bonding. And some estimates put it anywhere between 20 and 40% of gray-lag goose pair bonds are male-male. But we don't know that Clyde engaged in any such pair bonds. Clyde was queer in a different sense. There you see Clyde. And there you see ducklings who Clyde decided he was going to co-parent. The mother and ducklings are there. There's the father. Nowhere near as careful as Clyde was. So the ducklings came to the sanctuary because we recognize the right of reproductive freedom for everybody. We're not able to allow that among the mammals, but our policy ever since we began was that if birds were on eggs and making it very clear that they were being intentional about it and they were in a safe place where they weren't going to be killed by predators, that we would not interfere. That has not resulted in the population explosion that people thought it would. But Ozzy and Harriet, who have the hilariously heteronormative names, came to the sanctuary. Uh, they were pet store ducks who had been bought for a child on Easter. And it's not smart to buy ducklings for children, especially not when there's a dog in the house. And so they were surrendered to the sanctuary. Harriet had a broken wing, and Ozzy had a bad leg. Immediately upon arrival, they set about having ducklings. And they did, in fact, have the ducklings. We'll just watch this video one more time. And so they had something like 13 or 17 ducklings, which was a lot for Harriet to try and take care of. And poor Ozzy, as she would tour around, was limping along behind. And then Clyde was just like, okay, I am the grandmother of the ducklings, and was their constant companion. And Ozzy was, he got there eventually. So we have a whole bunch of pictures of the ducklings, and in all of them, you see Clyde's butt. I won't show you all. Unfortunately, I don't have too many pictures of like Clyde's face with the ducklings, but we do have the ducklings as they're growing up. So you can see they're much larger here than they were in the video. And here they all are. Wherever they went, Clyde took himself. There's his butt under a truck that they decided to seek shade in, and there's the mom and the ducklings. Um, I feel like that's pretty queer. The ducklings rewilded themselves. So Ozzy and Harriet stayed at the sanctuary. All of these ducklings, when they reached maturity, flew off and joined the wild ducks in the neighborhood. This was years and years and years ago. And so many of the wild ducks in the neighborhood, we have to assume, are the wild offspring of the poor pet store ducks who had been given to a child. That's a happy ending as far as I'm concerned. Peacocks. Well, here comes Rocky, and I have a story to tell you about Rocky. Rocky, seen here displaying, came to the sanctuary after authorities seized the animals from a petting zoo that was starving all the animals. Rocky had a lot of friends. He was called Rocky because he liked to perch on rock walls. Now you saw Rocky displaying before, and now you're going to see Rocky displaying again. Peacocks can display for two reasons. One, as a threat, and one as courtship. I saw Rocky do the threat display one time when an emu scared him. Everyone at the sanctuary, all the birds at the sanctuary, are scared of the emus, but Rocky was not. One time I saw him be surprised by an emu, and he just jumped up in the air with suddenly all of his feathers spread out, and he was so giant flying in the air that the emu turned and ran away, which was amazing to see. But you know when they're doing the courtship dance because they spread it out and then they start doing this little dance, and they also sometimes will click the stems of the feathers, so it's like a rattling percussive sound that goes along with this. The thing is that Rocky here is displaying not for a peahen. There were peahens on the property. Rocky is not displaying for a peahen. Rocky is displaying for Sharky the rooster, who Rocky had a serious crush on. Now, Sharky acted just like you would want a straight guy to do. He was like, I mean, you could almost hear him saying from his posture and the way he responded, like, nah, bro, I don't like you that way, but we can still be friends. And they were still friends. And they were part of a truly queer community that grew up in one part of the sanctuary. Like, now, Sharky came from cockfighting, uh, but was very, very, very glad to not be a fighter anymore. And like Rocky, he had lots of friends of lots of species. He liked to hang out with lots of people, but he especially liked to hang out with me. There he is on what was then my writing table, just hanging out. So what we did was we built him his own little house. He had his own little house by the Airstream trailer in which I was then living. And he'd come out every morning and hang out with me. And then, as I said, there was quite a community around there, so we ended up building a bunch of other little houses. Here's Rocky with his best friend Theo, belying the idea that roosters can't be friends, and especially that fighting roosters are so inherently aggressive that they can't possibly hang out with other roosters or even be near other roosters without attacking them. Sharky and Theo were super close. In that house, for a while, ducks and geese would lay their eggs. And there was one duck who started sitting on eggs, and we didn't interfere because we don't, even though we knew she was probably sitting on both duck and goose eggs. Eventually, one day, there came to be a duckling, but she didn't leave. She's still sitting on the egg. So the duckling is all alone. We don't understand what's happening. Was it because this was the egg of a different duck that we had no idea how to explain this. All we knew is that we had an orphan duckling, but not for long because Sharky adopted the duckling. Sharky adopted the duckling. I wish I had more photos of the two of them together, but Sharky adopted the duckling and the duckling imprinted it on Sharky. And when Sharky went to bed in his little house, the duckling followed. And they would sleep in there together. And then come out in the morning. And then that's the duckling. The front is the duckling a little older. In the back is Reddy, who was a particularly gender bending duck, who we think might have been the duckling's aunt. But in any case, she decided that she wanted in on raising the duckling. So then Reddy, the Muscovy duck, and Sharky, the former fighter, co-parented the duckling and then all went to bed in Sharky's little house every night. like the ducklings in the earlier story, she didn't rewild herself, but Junebug became a particularly wild duck. There you can see her and two other Muscovy ducks perching. I don't know if you know that Muscovy ducks are an offshoot. So they themselves are queer. They're an offshoot. They can have children with other ducks, but then the offspring are sterile. Those are the ducks like Jean-Paul and Jean-Claude are the children of partner of forced breeding between Muscovy and mallard ducks. Uh, but Muscovy ducks are the only ducks that roost in trees. So you can see her up there in the trees. There are more, but I wanted to end with this photo. Um, oh no! The other important thing is that Junebug returned the favor. And the next year, when she joined a hen to co-parent the hen's chicks. And I'm ending with this photo of a butterfly on a thistle for two reasons. One, because butterflies and moths are among the insects for whom same-sex relations, at least among males, are commonly observed. But also to remind us of all of the other sanctuary residents who aren't formal sanctuary residents. We do reserve more than half of our land as wildlife refuge. And even in the areas where cows and birds are grazing, we leave the weeds so that we can be a refuge for butterflies and bees and all of their queer friends as well. And so that's what I wanted to say about some of the queer animals at Vine. For those who aren't familiar with Vine, you can learn more about it on our website, and follow us on social media to meet more animals. Now I'm going to pause the recording again. Actually, I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you all for listening who are watching the recording. Now we're going to stop and discuss and not record so that people will have privacy.